Jonathan Weiner, welcome to Freedom Over Fascism.
Thank you, Stephanie. Let's always have freedom over fascism.
Right. It's now becoming clearer and clearer what we're really talking about with
Well, when you
with the
have former senior officials from the military and otherwise calling their former boss a fascist, the epitome of a fascist, that's really striking. It's disturbing, and it's important to notice and pay attention to and take action on.
absolutely. And one of the ways that one of the reasons we have you here is so you can help us understand how we can take action. Can you tell our listeners who are activists a little bit about yourself? You're an attorney, and why I'm talking to you today?
Sure, I was a journalist first, writing about legal issues, became an attorney, became counsel to Senator John Kerry, helped him get elected, worked on campaign finance and election issues for him for about 10 years. So I had practical involvement in campaigns. I worked on his presidential campaign and his debate preparation, among other things. And I've been working on the issues relating to elections, election law, for a very long time. And in recent years, I was also at the State Department working on these kinds of issues in part all over the world as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for international law enforcement, where we're constantly trying to deal with how do you keep things clean? How do you address corruption? How do you help systems stay on track? And I've been writing a lot over the past 5 years about the particular threat Donald Trump poses to democracy. I hosted a podcast series 4 years ago in which I warned of a bunch of terrible things that could happen. And I thought my views were extreme. The podcast was called Unconventional Threat. And it turned out they weren't extreme. They actually somewhat understated how bad it was going to be. Not very much, because we anticipated an awful lot of it.
Right.
And so since then, I've been looking closely at how Trump is going to try to overturn any election he loses, which he will try to do, and have analyzed exactly the mechanics of it all the way to the end. It gets very complicated, but there are some basic things which we can be sure of.
So, first, we know that he's going to try to cheat to win the election, right? They've already started voter suppression efforts, efforts to purge the voting rolls. What I think what we ought to talk about is what happens on and after election day. What will they try to do to win, and failing that, what will they do to try to do to steal or to engineer a coup
Right. So
for the election?
phase one, which we're going through now, is our voter suppression efforts, very traditional and untraditional mechanisms to try and prevent people from voting, and then have the vote not get counted. So if somebody votes to say this vote is illicit for the following reasons. And it's also to spread fear, uncertainty, and doubt amongst all Americans, and certainly all of their people, that the election's results are valid. And I'm not going to get back to that point because it's the fundamental one. If they lose 100 court battles, 1,000 court battles, if they win 5 and lose 995 of them, they can say all the ones we lost are proof that this election is no good because we raised legitimate issues and we got no remedy from the courts. So they'll try and delay certifications at the state level, at the county level. They'll then call into question those certifications, which are done by the governors pretty much. They may then try and prevent the Electoral College from meeting when it's supposed to meet. So there's two important phases. The first phase is the governors say, we've determined the results. Secretary of State and all the state officials say, here's how many votes there were in this county, this town, that town, and so on. And we found that Harris has won our state by blank votes. Right. Recount efforts, whatever, but there'll be efforts to prevent certification. When the governors certify, and there's a date under the Electoral Count Reform Act, which is the law that was passed 2 years ago to try and protect our elections after what Trump did last time. once the governors do that ascertainment, there'll be lawsuits trying to invalidate that. And those, I am confident, will fail.
Do you
But
think that
please,
the Republican? Do you think the Republican governors will um, certify as they ought to, or do you think some will refuse to certify?
it's possible. There's a wrinkle. There's a particular wrinkle where they don't just refuse to certify the presidential one, but they refuse to certify members of Congress who won their districts. We call this the Greg Abbott scenario in Texas, where in order to hold on to the House, they decide that X number of Democratic seats won't be certified. And my answer to that is let them go do that. If they're going to go do that, presumably Gavin Newsom can invalidate the same number or even more Republicans. Then every governor in the country can start invalidating. And this ludicrous approach, uh, um, tragicomic approach, I think in the end the courts say, no, this is unconstitutional. This is a denial of equal protection. There are a number of answers to those kinds of stunts. So I think it's possible, but my personal belief is that in the end, the courts will uphold state election laws, which are determine the results, not state politicians.
Right.
State politicians, even individual state officials, have to follow the law. And the law is pretty clear, which is why you had Republican secretaries of state, governors behave last time round. While there were
Right.
some election officials who didn't behave, it wasn't very many, and they were forced in the end to certify. So here, the goal is not necessarily to win the battles on certification if you're a Trump supporter. It's to say, look what a mess all of this is. We've been denied our rights. We made valid arguments. We lost. We have to take further action. So, what's the further action? And this is where my focus has been for a while now, because there are really good lawyers all the way up to the point where it becomes physical or political. So let's talk about the physical first and then
Yes,
go to the political. Does that work for you, Stephanie?
that works for me. Let's start at the point where the governors uh, certify their state
Yeah. So they
and see
certify
what happens there.
that's called ascertainment.
Ascertainment.
And so we've ascertained that the electors for Kamala Harris are the correct electors because she has won the state. And they need to meet in the state capitol on the day determined by the Electoral Count Reform Act, which is December 17th. And state law says where they are to meet. And they're to meet on the designated date under federal law, but they are to meet in a particular location. Pretty much every state
Right, which
says
makes them a little vulnerable.
it makes them a little vulnerable. So what's going on is that in the swing states, in particular, the purple states or swing states, governors are preparing for the risk to this event. Now, one of the interesting things in our system that people don't always pay attention to is that the National Guard is both federal and state. And the president controls the National Guard, but he's not the only one who does, or she.
Right.
The governors do as well. In some cases, in states, it's not even the governors, it's other senior officers that are designated, usually working with the governor. So you can protect the state capitol if you need to with National Guard. And you have to be very sensitive to get the intelligence on the ground as to what's going on. And it's not really very easy to organize an armed or unarmed um, rebellion or interference with people coming to vote. You can do it, but it's hard to do it without leaving fingerprints. It's hard to do it in secret because
Do
when
they care if they
yeah,
leave
I think you care.
fingerprints?
I think you care a lot because if you're not doing it in secret, if it's come to the Capitol, it will be wild, as Mr. Trump did last time when he was still president.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the government's supposed to respond to protect the electors. So there are various things that can be done to protect the electors and to ensure that they get in. And I think the governors are going to do that. So while there's real risk that day, which is December 17th, it's a risk that can be prepared for. Now let's pretend that they do shut down the Capitol. And so instead of meeting in the Capitol, they meet just outside the Capitol. They meet in the governor's home. They meet in some other building nearby. Under some state laws, you can designate an alternative place. That's right there in the state law. Governor has the right to do it. We've just had a lightning storm. The Capitol was struck by the lightning bolt. The building was demolished. Something blew up. Whatever.
Mm-hmm.
That can happen. And if the state's law and some of the state's laws allow it, if the state's law allows it, you can do it. The problem is that assuming that happens and they all meet under state law, but not in the Capitol, you're creating an issue. And we know what Rudy Giuliani would have done with that issue 4 years ago. We know what the others on Trump's election team would have done with that 4 years ago, and they'll do it again. That's not valid. They didn't meet in the Capitol. No matter that it was impossible, that's not valid. Doesn't matter. At that point, the governors they meet, they sign, and it gets sent to Washington. So we've just talked about violence, really, and because if you're preventing them from getting in, that's the use of physical force to prevent our democracy from functioning as it's supposed to under rule of law. So that would be illegal activity, criminal activity, might well be a criminal conspiracy, and people could face serious criminal penalties if they were to participate in any of that.
Right. And since we still, Joe Biden is still the president, it's easier to move the levers of power than if it's Trump sitting in his office next door to the
That's
Oval.
right. And so I would think the National Guard, if need be, will be called out by state governors or by the White House for the purpose of making it possible for the electors to vote. So my assumptions are actually quite optimistic about the fact that there'll be all kinds of challenges and bad things happening, and that our country is sturdy enough to get through all of them until the last couple of stages, which we're going to get to next, which are where I start to worry. So do I worry about ascertainment and certifications coming in a timely fashion? I think it's going to be litigated with the goal of delaying it.
Right.
But in
well,
the
that
end,
seems to be a pattern.
Yeah, I think that's what they'll do. But I also believe that the courts will not allow themselves to be manipulated that way. There may be individual loose cannons. Here, speaking of a particular judge in Florida who was a Trump judge, who's behaved very badly. But the system in the end, I think, will cause certifications to be made that are the correct ones, whatever they are.
Okay.
That's my belief. I could be wrong. I hope I'm right. Then
I hope you're right too.
Yeah. Then I think there could be efforts to prevent the Electoral College from meeting, and I think that will be overcome in the end by a mixture of rule of law, court orders, and, if necessary, physical protection. So that takes us to late December. In late December, one can imagine efforts by the outgoing Congress under the control of Mike Johnson, an election denier in the House, to try to interfere with or prevent the new House from coming into power. But the old Congress doesn't get to decide anything about the new Congress. The new Congress comes. Who are the correct people to vote is decided under state law. Mm-hmm. And so if the courts had determined that every member of Congress, who the right winner is, I believe in the end that's going to have to be also honored. It could be very messy, and you could have a situation where there's no speaker elected, or in which there's two speakers elected, purportedly, because the parties disagree as to who the valid members of Congress are. But of course, you're supposed to be sworn in by the president or by the secretary of the Senate. There's that part of it as well. So there's a lot of little messing things that can happen messing around in
Right.
that period to establish the new Congress.
Right.
But let's pretend none of that's resolved particularly well,
Okay.
and that there are stunts like what I call the Greg Abbott stunt, which has been discussed. Um, doesn't mean he's going to do it, but there have been rumblings about it. Um, at that point, you have a situation where Senator Josh Hawley said in 2020, when we had 2/3 of the Republicans in the House after the insurrection voting to decertify states, Biden won 4 or 5 of them.
Right.
After they had just been attacked, cowering under desks, threatened,
Right.
stalked, brutalized, and 2/3 of them still said, we're going to vote to decertify. Now,
Right.
only a couple of senators did. Maybe it was only Ted Cruz. But what Josh Hawley said was very interesting. What he said was, now we get to choose. We get to decide and review it. We understand the courts have finished their review. We understand the governors have finished their review. But we have the chance to make a decision. Well, that's not really how our law works or is supposed to work, because the grounds under the Electoral Count Reform Act, and before that the Electoral Count Act, going back to the late 19th century, is that you can only reject certifications on the grounds that a certification wasn't regularly given or wasn't the actual result, in effect, is defective because it wasn't the actual result. These are supposed to be very narrow, not technical grounds based on objective criteria, like Trump really won Pennsylvania based on the votes certified by the Secretary of State, but Josh Shapiro put the Democratic electors in anyway. That would be a legitimate not regularly given. Or Harris really won Texas based on the vote counts in Texas, and Governor Greg Abbott chose to send the Trump electors in anyway. In those cases, that would not be regularly given. In the other case, it's in the other language, which is that it's not it's not essentially a proper elector, goes to someone who's too young to be a candidate that's too young, wrong age, wasn't born in the United
Mm,
States.
correct.
It's supposed to deal with those kinds of extreme examples where it's cut and dry that the person isn't qualified to be president because they can't, under the Constitution, be president. It's not that. I think the vote counting was wrong. I think somebody cheated. I think it was fraud. I think it was rigged. I
Mm-hmm.
don't like the result. I hate Harris or I hate Trump. Those are not legitimate reasons, or I feel like voting the other way. But what happened? The problem with that is, while we know what the correct legal answer is, how do you enforce that legal answer? So when Josh Hawley gets together with 19 other senators, Republican senators, and votes to decertify Arizona, if Trump went for Harris, I mean, if Arizona went for Harris, and there are 87, I think the number is, members of the House. It's 1/5 of the House, which would be half, less than half of the
Right.
Republican caucus. It would be, 2/3 of the Republican caucus is all you would need. The houses then separate, and each house votes as to whether to decertify her. And so you can imagine a situation at that point where the House votes to decertify. Now this gets really complicated, or the Senate does, really complicated if there isn't a Speaker of the House, because there hasn't been agreement on that, or if it's two competing houses. But there is a scientific, verifiable answer to the question of who actually won the seat. Pretty much,
Right.
pretty much everywhere, based on the votes. And so, in the end, the courts ought to be able to resolve questions about who's in and who isn't. But the Constitution also says the House and the Senate organize themselves, each of these chambers. So in a situation of very little trust, it could get really, really messy. But in the end, under the Electoral Count Reform Act, like the Electoral Count Act before it, both chambers have to say, no, Arizona was no good. Both chambers. And what Susan Collins, the author in the Senate of the Electoral Count Reform Act, says, Republican from Maine, is we designed the reforms to make it harder to screw things up and to make it much easier for the actual counts to be respected and to ensure that. So the most important bulwark we have to protect our democracy and keep our republic are Republican senators such as Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, who's very independent, for
Right.
starters, and Todd Young, a very conservative senator from Indiana, who is part of the Electoral Count Reform Act process and has talked about the need to uphold it, saying we're not going along with any efforts to decertify anybody. We respect the governors. We respect that the governors have done the right thing by their voters. And there doesn't seem to be any question about who won the vote. And if a few of them do that, that could save the country from this gigantic mess.
Well,
And
that's
Susan,
pretty. I mean, I have faith in Lisa Murkowski, but Susan Collins gets very concerned, although she did write the bill, and Todd Young is quite radical. I'm not going to call him conservative. I don't think that's the right name for Republicans right now. Um,
but
so
he's been good on this issue so far and has addressed it pretty explicitly.
okay,
And Susan Collins is addressing it explicitly. Now, I have real questions about whether she has her finger on the pulse of her party and is speaking frankly, because what she said lately is she can't imagine how you could get 20 Republicans in the Senate voting to decertify.
well,
That's what
that's
she said within the last week or two. And so I
one
can't imagine,
wonders.
I can't myself can't imagine how you could have more than a handful saying no to Donald Trump, given what we've seen so far in the purging of anyone who doesn't do what he wants. So I think there's a big risk there. But part of the risk is Supreme Court risk. And so we talked about law and how confident I am that the law is going to protect us and how robust it is. We then talked about the threats of violence or interference. And we discussed why I thought in the end that would work out probably too. Then we talk about politics, where, as Josh Hawley says, we get to decide. It's not the voters, it's not the governors. Constitution gives us the right to decide. Now, actually, it doesn't. 12th Amendment says they sit there. It doesn't say they choose, decide. But that's never been determined by any Supreme Court so far. We
Right.
don't have an ultimate Supreme Court ruling on the degree to which senators and Republicans have discretion here. So ideally, you would save the court from itself. You would save the court from the risk of the court devolving into a partisan institution to just deliver an election to Trump. Now, that might happen. Here's the risk: you have 20 Republican senators and 87 Republican members of Congress voting to decertify Arizona. Each of these, by the way, has to be debated separately. So after you reach a conclusion on Arizona, you then get to go to whatever your next state in contention might be. Maybe it's Georgia,
Mm-hmm.
maybe it's Michigan, maybe it's Pennsylvania, maybe it's before you get to Pennsylvania, I left out Nevada and New Mexico. Then you get to Pennsylvania, you get to Wisconsin. You could go beyond that because if you could have 20 Democrats and 87 Democrats and say, well, we're going to debate Texas, we're going to debate Florida, we're going to debate Oklahoma. We'll debate all 50 if
Mm-hmm.
that's the way you're going. Well, the Electoral Count Reform Act allows you to do that, but there's a couple hours debate on each of those. So it'd be a very ugly pathway. if they decide to go this way. But the requirement, again, is both chambers. So if a few Republican senators say no, probably that chamber wouldn't vote to decertify, only the House. And in that case, at that point, the states go through, and you've elected Harris president, assuming she's actually won under the electoral won the electoral college, as the law defines a win. But the additional risk is if they get the Supreme Court involved, the Supreme Court might have different ways of screwing things up. Now, if you've got Republicans like Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, and maybe it isn't Todd Young, maybe it's Mitch McConnell, who decides there are levels of chaos he doesn't, that's too much for him. I think in that situation, it's much less likely that the Republicans on the Supreme Court are going to make a partisan ruling, because they're going to see that not only would it create chaos and tear the country apart and create potential violence, which we'll talk about in a bit, but it could be seen as invalid when Republicans have already said it's wrong. So the need to have Republican politicians honor their obligations to the country at this moment is utterly critical. And the need to talk about let every vote be counted, let every voter be allowed to vote, let every vote be counted, and make sure the counts stand. That mantra is really going to be critical to creating a political framework that the country will survive. Now, if they get the election to the House of Representatives due to no one having a majority in the electoral count, because you could go tit for tat with Republicans and Democrats challenging one another's respective counts. The Republicans will win. They're going to control at least 26 states, basically based on the gerrymandering at the state level that affects the number of people in Congress and what parties they belong to. That is the number of members from each party, but more importantly, the total numbers in particular states.
Right, because each state would have its own vote.
Each state gets one vote. So Wyoming gets a vote, Texas gets a vote, California gets a vote, New York, everyone gets one vote. And in that, the Republicans win, even if the Democrats were to control the House. And even if they were to control it by a decent number, almost certainly Republicans would win. They'll just pick up North Carolina, for example, which was a tie this current Congress due to gerrymandering that forced out 3 Democrats. So, given all of that, the Supreme Court could potentially try and deliver it to a contingent election, which the Republicans would win. They could say one house's objections are enough. It doesn't require 2. That's what the Electoral Count Reform Act says, but we're going to interpret the 12th Amendment to require both. Is that pulled out of thin air? Yes.
Well, that doesn't seem to have stopped them.
Do I know what language I would use, how I would write their opinion to find it unconstitutional in that area and to say one house is enough? I could write that opinion.
Right.
It wouldn't take me an afternoon. It would take me a few days to fill in the sites, but not the logic or the reasoning. Is it legitimate? No. Can they do it? Yes. So it's a legal political situation, or a political legal situation, not just a legal.
Correct.
So what can we do, given all that, to avoid that these nightmare scenarios? Well, first, it's really important to not elect election deniers to Congress. It's of real importance. The fewer election deniers are, the healthier the country will be. So we'll start with that. Second, it's really important to have that mantra I just talked about. Let every person vote, let the votes be counted, and make sure the counts hold, the counts stand. That becomes really important. And one should also, I think, talk about what the world will look like if the chaos envelops the country. Trump's the chaos candidate. That's what he is. He
Hmm.
thrives, he creates it, he thrives off it, he wins through it. And the more chaos they can create, the better off he is. The court should be stabilizers. The Supreme Court isn't, but they should be. And so, to the extent that one starts talking about the economic chaos as well as the physical chaos that will take place if this goes into the worst places becomes very important. So I don't know whether you have any investments that you are going to rely on for your retirement, or if any of your friends have investments that they're going to rely on for retirement, or any of them are retired now, or trying to put kids through college, or trying to pay for their mortgages. And if they depend on any kind of economic activity, which could potentially come unglued if the country became unglued. Imagine a situation in which Harris has actually won the state of Pennsylvania, and that those votes aren't counted. Their votes aren't counted because Republicans in Congress have said they refuse to, and the Supreme Court has said we're not going to interfere, we're not going to force them. Well, what happens at that point is business confidence goes, economic confidence goes down, business confidence goes down, the stock markets go crazy, and not in a good way, because one thing we know they don't like is chaos, and we have a business catastrophe and an economic catastrophe. Now, is that what moves me or you, Stephanie? Probably not so much, but there are people who are establishment Republicans, the pillars of the community, the CEOs, often the COOs, the CFOs, and other people in companies all across the United States who, regardless of their general partisan preference, are really strongly anti-chaos, because chaos is really not good for business. And so I think people need to think about the consequences of what happens if rule of law breaks down and we're in a situation where votes are not respected. We could be in a pre-Civil War state, because you can imagine the partisan passions that will get unleashed if we get into such a situation. So countering chaos at every turn through planning and framing. Planning being things like when do you bring out the National Guard? How do you protect the vote? Framing is the frame of rule of law and and um, and order
Hmm.
and respect for the vote versus chaos. That stuff matters. And the more one talks about the need for the vote to be respected, I think the better off we'll be. And those messages can be heard by some Republican elected officials at the federal level, as well as at the state level. And also emphasizing the fact that conspiracies to overturn elections are punishable under state law and federal law. And while that process is incomplete from 2016-17, it's still ongoing. And there are a lot of people who went to jail for the insurrection. And there are more who could go to jail if people were to try it again. So there are tools.
It seems, I hear you say there are tools and there are consequences. But if Trump and the Republicans manage to take power, those consequences disappear.
Oh, if Mr. Trump becomes president, you don't have to ask me what will happen. You have to look at what General Milley says would happen, what his former chief of staff, John Kerry, said he tried to do already, and you have to. And I think it's quite clear he will use the IRS and the Justice Department, now granted direct control. He's been granted direct control of the Justice Department by 6 members of the Supreme Court. He will use those as tools against his political enemies.
Right.
You're
And
speaking
he
to and
has,
you're speaking to a person who already was the subject of an agreement between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin to be interrogated by the Russians because I was on the list of about a dozen people who Putin asked for it, and Trump said, sure, let's do it, in Helsinki, Finland. When Trump then met with Putin off camera with no one else present other than the Russian translator. No
Right.
American translator was used. So we don't know what Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin agreed when no one else was present. I do know that I was among the people named to be interrogated by the Russians because of my involvement in something called the Magnitsky Act, which is a human rights law which has been used to go after Russian officials, among others, who are corrupt and have engaged in serious human rights violations. And because of that background and my involvement with alerting federal officials to contacts between people in the Trump campaign and the Russian government, and what the Russian government was allegedly doing to tilt the election to Trump in 2016, I'm not a friend of Mr. Trump or Mr. Putin, and therefore I was named there. So that's what happened to me. What happened to Greg Craig, former White House counsel for Barack Obama, is he got indicted in Washington after the U.S. attorney in New York said there's no case here for what he did, which was to write a report about Ukraine and give the report to a journalist. He wasn't acting as a foreign agent. And then what happened is that Main Justice, probably Bill Barr, but we don't know for sure, got the U.S. attorney in D.C. to indict him. He was acquitted almost immediately. John Durham indicted one of my friends, Michael Sussman. He was acquitted immediately. Jury said it's on him, meaning it's on the prosecutor. Had contempt for the case. These were political cases. They went after Comey with the IRS. They went after Andrew McCabe with the IRS. These things happened already. And this was an environment where much of the time, and probably most of the time, they said no to Trump when he tried to do this. He'll do it worse next time, there's no doubt about it.
Right. There'll be nobody to stop him. And he's already said what he'll do. So let's go back. Where are the points where normal people like us can make a difference in changing the course of this post-election landscape, knowing that the media has not yet shown itself to be responsible for reporting accurately about what's at stake. So where can people make a difference? Is it in the way they talk on social media, talk to their friends? Is there anything else that people can do to help this navigate the narrow confines of making it to January 20th?
I think that talking about the risk of chaos if rule of law isn't upheld and how that could hurt everybody, regardless of whether you're Republican or Democrat, regardless of who you voted for, is an important framing that we have stability or we have chaos, and stability is really a much better way for the country to go. And that's going to affect people economically as well as politically. I think that's important. Most people know and have members of their family who are in the other political party or have been. And talking to them from this framing about the need for the votes to be upheld and for certification to go ahead so the country's not divided and falling apart is really important. And saying that we're going to respect that and everybody needs to respect that. Now, if Mr. Trump winds up sending people in violently to use force, and there's always the threat of force in back of what he talks about. He's always playing that game. It could well devolve to a situation where you've got people on both sides fighting. That would be really bad for the country. Now, talking about Trump, there's an expression that was used during the Hitler years that is actually really important to be aware of. And the expression was called leading towards the Fuhrer. Leading towards the Fuhrer. Fuhrer means leader.
Right.
So how can you say leading towards the Fuhrer? What it meant was based on what Hitler said, generally, people then said, oh, we should do the things that are consistent with that. He doesn't need to tell us more. He doesn't need to order us to do anything. We're going to do that on the basis of what he's been saying generally. So when Hitler would give a speech about his general goals, any number of people inside the German government would then seek to carry out what they thought he wanted to do. Mr.
Well,
Trump has a similar kind of technique. He goes on, he makes a public statement. It used to be a tweet, now it's an X or whatever they call it, or a so-called truth. He is Orwellian, and then people will then do things that they want him to do. And so I think we should be very aware that when he makes these statements, it does cause people to respond. And the bulwark against that are people who have been Republicans historically and who are willing to take a stand now in favor of the system and upholding the system as opposed to tearing it down.
so
Now,
we've had a. Oh, go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, I want just one more moment, Stephanie.
Mhm.
I'm working with people who include a lot of different Republican officials, past officials, judges, senators, members of Congress, um, state officials, state election officials, uh, who are doing a lot in the swing states on these themes. And they're trying to reach out to the people who voted for them before
Mhm.
to take this seriously and approach it this way. And I think it's the single most important thing we can do. People who we don't necessarily agree with on policy, but we do agree with on the basic premise of what it is to be an American and how the country is supposed to function. And I think at the state level, the infection, the virus is not as deep. It's there, but it's not as deep as it now is at the federal level. Because at the federal level, they're so afraid of being targeted by him that even the ones that know better mostly do what he wants.
So this bulwark, the former or current Republicans who are standing up against or for democracy or for the rule of law, and they've signed open letters, and Liz Cheney has been campaigning with Kamala Harris, and John Kelly came out and talked about Trump, meeting the criteria of fascist. Do you think that enough of them will have enough influence to keep this on track?
We have to help them. And the way in which we help them is to do as much as we can in messaging terms, retail and wholesale, after the election, in the period from, say, November 10th, 11th, 12th, through January 6th, to make this be understood as illegitimate if Harris, in fact, has won. If Trump has, in fact, won the popular vote in enough states fairly, granting it's not fair to do voter suppression, but fairly based on the rules that existed and who actually voted. And by the way,
Mm-hmm.
my mail-in ballot, which I sent in a month ago, has been lost in my home state, so I'm going to have to go do a provisional ballot because it disappeared after I put it in the postal system. Why they didn't get rid of Louis LaJoy, I don't know. But that's what happened to me. But if he actually wins, the Democrats are going to have to, as upset as we're going to be, as much protection as we're going to want to give ourselves by any means we can, cannot be contested through illegitimate means. All things we're talking about are illegitimate. There's legitimate and there's illegitimate. And
Right. And the Democrats tend to stay on the side of institutions and legitimacy.
yeah, though there have been times when they made political points. Um, this was done when Kerry lost in 2004, and Barbara Boxer voted not to certify. There were questions about the election machines in Ohio. I had to live all of that very intimately at the time. And Kerry immediately conceded once they had internal discussion with his voting law experts and his voting law experts, election law experts, um, who were very, very experienced election law insiders. I can't be more specific than that, but the best in the entire country said you're not going to win legitimately, given what's happened in Ohio with the vote count. It's just you can delay it, but it's not going to turn around. And he then conceded, precisely for the reason that Al Gore did what he did after the Supreme Court pulled the stunt that it did in 2000, um, awarding the presidency to George Bush that Al Gore actually won. And Gore, to preserve the country, did the right thing. Kerry, to preserve and protect the country, did the right thing. I assume Democrats will do the right thing. But this is a different.
The right thing doesn't necessarily get you the right result at this point.
That's right.
So
that's right. But the problem of chaos, once you're fighting in the streets, it becomes really hard to put the country back together. So if Trump legitimately wins, people can have different understandings of the word legitimately. And let me be clear, my wife views me to be at risk personally if he wins. I think I've been largely forgotten in that regard, politically, in terms of my political salience. She's extremely anxious about it. So, do I want a Trump presidency? No, I do not want a Trump presidency. But I'm also deeply concerned about what fighting in the streets could do to the country and how you put things back together. It could be very problematic. So, rather than think about the worst, let's see if we can get results that avoid the worst. Get non-election deniers into federal office. Frame the issue so that people understand the importance of upholding the vote. Talk about the economic risks as well as the political risks. Talk about the need for people, regardless of their partisan R or D, their partisan jersey, to uphold rule of law. And if you know people in the newspaper business, if you know people in the Chamber of Commerce, if you know people at universities, if you know people at law schools, if you know people at churches, any community institution that you participate in where you can potentially ventilate these issues and talk about the difference between the right thing and the wrong thing, I think helps. Now, how many people do we need to do the right thing? Well, in individual states, a few thousand votes can make a huge difference. And at the federal level, a small number of different members of Congress and senators can make a huge difference. Colin Allred could get rid of one of the worst people in the United States Senate, person who voted to overturn the last election, Ted Cruz.
Right.
I don't know whether John Tester's got a chance or not. Hard to say. I don't know whether Debbie Murcaso-Powell, I'm probably mispronouncing it, in Florida, has got a chance.
Right.
But those are consequential elections. The guy who's running as an independent against Deb Fischer in Nebraska, it's a consequential election. And this is true in every House race in the country. They're all consequential this year.
They are at every level. So if you had one action that you would recommend that the listeners take, what would that one action be? And what would the time frame would you say that they need to do it in?
Well, there's different actions at different times. For the next 2 weeks, it's get out the vote in the swing states, period. Any action you can do to help get out the vote. And that's it. That's the most important thing. There'll then be a period of time where the messaging about respecting the count and the vote, the messaging becomes the most really important thing from about November 10th onward.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the month of November, it's about respecting the voters' will and how important it is and how essential that is to our stability as a country. We don't want a repeat of an insurrection. We don't want a repeat of a coup effort. Anybody who does those things is putting themselves at risk hugely, as well as their country at risk. And that framing is really important, that messaging element in that period of time. And I think that's the next thing. For people who are in a position to, if you've got any contacts with members of Congress, of any party, it's really important to talk about these issues. I'm represented by Jamie Raskin. Jamie knows this stuff as well as anybody in the country. He's read my articles for what it's worth, where I laid all of this out, and I think they're very much focused on it and ahead of the game. I think there are a lot of awareness. If the Democrats control the House of Representatives, they will have a lot of opportunities to prevent many of the stunts. And it makes it much harder for the Supreme Court to deliver this to Mr. Trump illegitimately. So the House really does matter in terms of the partisan control of the House.
So, one last question. Do you feel that the Democrats up and down the ballot, up and down the levels of official office have been thinking about this enough and have been planning a strategy enough? Or do you think that they should have been more active in thinking ahead?
I have been really unimpressed over the years about the degree to which Democrats have done wargaming and scenario planning that is sufficient to deal with the kinds of situations they've been faced. Deeply unimpressed over a very long period of time. No, I'm not a member of a political party. I'm a Democrat, is the old joke.
Right.
However, this year, in a number of the swing states, the governors are working with outside groups to do scenario planning and to think about every protection they can put in place. It's why I am so much less anxious about all the stunts that are going to be carried out between now and December 17th than I am about the period between January 3rd and January 6th. But it's much harder for them to do what they might want to do between January 3rd and January 6th, assuming that Kamala Harris has actually won, if we do our jobs in the period leading up to those dates. So different things have to happen at different phases. Right now, it's get out the vote. Then it's messages about stability and what happens if the votes aren't respected. And then after that, when you get into that late period, it's really about pressure on individual members of Congress to do the right thing. Because there are Donald Trump may be the person who the generals have said are fascists. But when one says, I can ignore the vote, I get to decide, as Josh Hawley did with his black glove salute,
Right.
which brought back the 1920s and 30s for me.
Yeah.
Then freedom over fascism means overcoming the fascists. And that means you have to have enough people on your side to do it.
That's right. That's right. Well, thank you so much for talking this through with us. Knowing what could happen, I think, is really important for people to know how to contribute to maintaining our freedom and our democracy in our country. So I really appreciate your time, and
Thank you. It was a
thank you for
pleasure
coming
to
on.
last, as a pitch, in case anyone's interested, if you want to read my writings on these topics, which cover an awful lot of ground, I've been writing on this principally for the Washington Spectator. So if you go to Washington Spectator and type my name in, you'll find the articles which lay out the scenarios and the law and the politics and what to do at some length and detail. The only thing that I would urge you is that when I refer to Lindsey Graham in the course of the last
Oops. That's okay. I will link to
Yeah. In fact,
I will link to your things.
the only thing about the only thing is I mentioned Lindsey Graham because he voted in favor of the Electoral Count Reform Act. That doesn't mean that I necessarily think he's going to be the solution.
Right. I don't think anyone's really counting on Lindsey
Okay.
Graham.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks.
I'll let you know when it goes up.
As you will. Bye bye.
All right. Bye-bye.